Hi there, everyone. My name is Max, and I'd like to thank you all on behalf of Vroman's Bookstore for tuning into tonight's event with us. Today, we're lucky to have Anna Sale in conversation with Heather Havrilesky, discussing Anna's book, Let's Talk About Hard Things. Anna is the creator and host of Death, Sex, and Money, the podcast from WNYC Studios about the things we think about a lot and need to talk about more. After debuting at the top of the Apple Podcast chart in 2014, Death, Sex, and Money was named the #1 podcast of the year by New York Magazine in 2015. Anna won a Gracie for Best Podcast Host in 2016, and the show won a 2018 Webby for Best Interview Show. And with her, Heather is an American author, essayist, and humorist. She writes the advice column Ask Polly for New York Magazine and is the author of Disaster Preparedness, a memoir, the advice book How to Be a Person in the World, and the essay collection What If This Were Enough. Today's event does include a Q&A portion, so if you'd like to ask Anna a question at any point, you can go ahead and click that Ask a Question button towards the bottom, and they'll go ahead and get to that towards the end of the event. And lastly, if you would like to purchase Let's Talk About Hard Things, you can go ahead and click that green button right down below, and it'll take you to our website. But with that all out of the way, I will go ahead and let them take over now. Thank you all so much.
Yay!
Hello.
Hi.
Anna, nice to see you. Thank you to everyone who's here. And Anna, so glad to see your face in person. I finished the last pages of your book today and I loved it. But it it did, and I'm sure you've heard this before, it made me consider whether or not I'm actually any good at talking about hard things. And I have to say that I was alarmed when I started the book that the entire book starts with death, which makes sense because your podcast is Death, Sex, and Money, obviously. But even though I write in my column over and over again, face your mortality, face death, death is staring you in the face. And it's good for you to look at death. I started to read that chapter and I thought, I don't want to read about death. I'm not up for this. Which made me realize, just how squeamish we can all be no matter what we do every day. And then I sat there and cried about miscarriages and dying sisters, and I walked around in a state all day thinking about death. So I must not be as at peace with my own mortality and others' mortality as I thought. So I'm wondering, over the course of writing your book, if you were surprised to learn that you actually struggle to talk about some things, and if so, what things are the hardest for you to talk about?
I just want to say that's a resounding endorsement for the book, Heather. You're going to walk around like a zombie thinking about
I know, I'm sorry. Sorry. But I mean, it was a jarring choice to begin your book with death.
I know. Well, actually, I think it was sort of looking at it. I think it was it's a cool way to start because I don't like when you think about hard things and the ways we experience them. Death is one of those things, certainly like how we are oriented as far as like privilege and power in society. It affects how we encounter death and our ability to have good health outcomes, etc. But it's also kind of like death is coming for all of us in a pretty similar way. We're going to be dead. So I like.
I'm not going to be, but it's sad for you, and I'm sorry about that.
Thank you. So that was sort of like, this is a hard thing that all of us will encounter in very different ways, but also in this starkly similar way of just alive and then dead. Someone we love will be alive and then dead, and we ourselves will be alive and then dead. And yes, to answer your question, did I find that I was like a lot less chill and down and evolved than I thought I was? Like 100%, because I've been doing stories and talking to people about loss and grief in different ways for a long time on Death, Sex, and Money. But I still, I write about it. I have this very dear friend named Ann Simpson, who's now 89, and I became friends with her when she was 82. And I still, when I hang out with her, I will come home and I have this sense of like, oh my God, she's not going to be here for as long as I want her to be. And I had it, I, as part of working on the book, I was like, I think I ought to talk to her about that. I'm curious if she's aware and like what she thinks about being in her 80s. Like if she thinks, oh my God, I'm not going to be here as long as I want to be here. And I found in talking to her about it, what we could have a conversation about was what's it like to experience physical decline as a proud person, as somebody who has not experienced a lot of illness in your life. Like, what's it like to take someone's arm when you're walking beside them? You know, how have you come to that? And what do you think about? What do you think about when you think about not being here? And we talked about those things, but it didn't make that like the urgency lesson of like one day Anne is not going to be here and I love her so much. But what that conversation did provide was I could say, I have this, you know, I just think about how I just want to make sure you know how much I love you and how much you've been meaningful in my life. And, you know, and just had that moment of just like putting it on the table, like, this is the thing. I just really want you to know. And she nodded. And then the interview was over. And then she's still going to die, you know, and I'm still going to die. And that's what we can, that's all that words can do around death and loss is to communicate as best we can what we mean to each other while we can. But it's not going to soften loss, you know, you can't, and all of us have felt this when we want to comfort somebody who's in deep grief. You can't offer words as much as we want to figure out the right words to say in our condolence card that's going to relieve some of their sadness, but you can't do that. But what you can do that actually is really meaningful is figure out how to not need that, and instead can just be with them in their grief and be with them in that feeling of helplessness that comes with loss.
Yeah, I mean, I like that about that chapter that you stay on this, you stay in this place of, it's, you know, you don't struggle to bring closure to every story. You stay in a place of just let it be hard. There's no way around it. You know, it's like someone is there and then they're not there. It's hard. And, you know, I really liked the part about, I can't remember her name, but the woman who died of cancer and her brother. Yeah. Did you say Shelley?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Shelley. So her brother was talking about how she wanted him to accept that she was going to die. It was almost like she was helping him face the reality of it. And then he helped the people at her memorial, right, kind of also face the fact, not just of her death, but also she knew that she was going to die. I mean, in some ways it was like part of that was giving them some peace around her acceptance, because it certainly feels like, I mean, there's no way to accept it, but there's a way that all of this talk, I mean, it's almost like when the person is living, you follow their lead. But a lot of the talk around death ultimately is about the survivors coping with this inevitability. But I love how you left everything on like no, it doesn't get to be that easy. Like it can't be wrapped up that easily. Was that a conscious choice that you made when you were crafting that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of what I didn't really know when I started writing, but I found like writing about, you know, death to begin with. That was the first chapter I wrote. I was like, so what can we talk about when we talk about death? And maybe if you do really look at like, this is what I can't fix about this hard thing, but here's this other way I can show up for the hard thing and be with someone through the hard thing. That's what I can do. And if you look at the hard thing, loss, grief, the inevitability of our mortality, and see like, that's not my job to make that less scary. You know, my job is actually to be in a relationship with the person who's feeling that, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So And I feel like Shelley and her brother Mike were just such wonderful in sharing that story with me, that is what she did. She died in midlife of melanoma. Like, there are plenty of people who have that kind of terminal diagnosis and just die saying, like, why me? Why this? And instead, she figured out a way to say, this is what is happening, and the end is coming. And these are the conversations I'm going to try to have with the people I love. Like, what
Yeah.
strength.
Yeah, I really loved the examples in that chapter. And I feel like every chapter, though, had great examples. How did you find the people that you decided to focus on in your book? And was it an issue of, because each chapter, okay, so just to explain to anyone who hasn't read the book yet, there are 5 sections: death, sex, money, family, and identity. And there are probably are there about 4 examples of people that you talk to for each section, or 4 or 5 maybe?
Maybe it's like a grand total of like 32 or 33 people.
Oh, okay.
And more stuff. So I guess that.
Oh, that's more like 7 per section. That's a lot. So I wondered, because the stories were so, what's that?
It was a lot. Woo!
It's a lot
of work.
The stories were they seemed, I mean, they were really good stories. And a lot of times you circled back to the people and talked to them twice or 3 times over the course of several years. Did you start off with people you'd talked to through the podcast? Some people were sort of people you knew through friends, maybe. I'm interested in what your selection process was like, because there's such a great selection of stories.
Thank you. I mean, it was really a kind of like I think of it like a amoeba moving, because I had a couple of different objectives, which were, what do I have to say about death? Then I would work on the sex chapter. I wanted to, for example, sex. I wanted to talk about someone with a history of assault and communicating that with a partner. I wanted to talk about rejection and the importance of learning how to hear when someone is saying, I don't want what you want. I wanted to talk about kind of like the very, like, in the moment, like, what is going to happen tonight kind of sex conversation with someone who's a new partner. I wanted to talk to somebody whose body had changed from illness and how that changed, how they found words for that. And I wanted to talk about like sex conversations inside the context of a long-term relationship where the changes are sort of less clear and abrupt, but all of a sudden you're 40 and you look at your partner and you're like, like, this has changed. Like, are you getting what you need here? So it was sort of like, those are all the
40, you say.
I just turned 40. As an example, pull that out of the front, middle, little front, what is it called? Middle of the air. And then I thought, well, I wanted to like have a really different, like, I didn't want the characters to all be a certain demographic. I wanted them to be from different parts of the country. I wanted them to be different races. I wanted them to be different classes. I wanted them to be different ages. So it was sort of like this process of kind of like, that's an interesting conversation. Like, and it was a mix of kind of reaching out on Twitter to like, hey, anybody had an experience that they'd like to share about communicating in a new relationship after they've had assault and sexual assault. And I think because, some people would respond given the kind of, those people knew the kind of journalism I did, because that's obviously like a very bold question on Twitter. But, and then I would come back around and I'd say, this is how I'm working on this book. This is how we'll be in conversation about this. You can use your name, you can change your name, And I'm going to be in conversation with you for a few years because this book is going to be a long process. And then I would find people who, who'd written interesting things. So it was just kind of like, it was reporting. And then the hardest part for me, like, that's what I do with my team on Death, Sex, and Money, like we're always sort of like, oh, that's an interesting narrative arc that we could explore with someone. Like, well, let's reach out. But what was different for me about the writing process was I had to push myself, and my editors pushed me to be like, so what, Anna? So what is at the end of each story? It's an interesting story that you're telling, but this person has said this happened to them, and this is how they talked about it with their partner. But what's the 2 or 3 paragraphs to make it more broadly applicable so that someone can use this book in their lives? And this is what the writing you do. And I found it very, it's really hard to do that well, you know, because I was like, so much of my voice as a writer is, and as a journalist has been like, just tell me, I'm interested in the particulars. And then to be like, and thus and so you ought to do this. You know, it's like, was sort of, you know, that was the part that was trickier for me. But
you know, the mechanics, just to interrupt for a second, the mechanics of those sections where you're breaking down the principles of how to talk about sex, or with the things that come up, it's very precise and very almost mathematical writing in a good way, in a way that I could never do, actually, which is, it's not, you're not just like about to fall off a cliff. It's like, it's very like thoughtful, and you know, it felt very symmetrical and easy to navigate the main ideas of what you were saying, which is important for a book like this, because, you know, you're trying to say, these are the major principles of doing something that you basically don't want to do.
Yeah. And here's why you should. And I think that means a lot, because that was why I decided to write the book, because but also what was really hard, because I'd never done it before. Like, on Death, Sex, and Money, I know kind of how I want to explore with someone, but I have this idea that I have these set of principles, but then to be forced to write down, like, here's a way to listen ethically and to stand up for yourself ethically. Like, it's trickier, because you know, when you're talking about a hard conversation, just generally, there's the calculus of, is my primary objective to make this person feel really heard and validated, or is my primary objective to make sure they see me? And that can be in conflict. You know, you can, if you're talking to someone in a way to like, they need to face this truth, and I'm going to speak truth to power, you're going to make them uncomfortable and disrupt their status quo. If your primary objective is, I'm going to really try to call them in, I'm going to speak in a different way. So I was trying to sort of just like create the scaffolding, build the scaffolding to help each of us kind of figure out, in this conversation, this is really what I'm going to try to do. So maybe I'm going to try to have it in this way.
Yeah, I mean, it seems also, though, that there's another layer, which is in relationships where you are going into it. I mean, this is sort of hinted at throughout the book, and it's talked about in concrete examples, but you're going into these situations in relationships so often where the unfortunate agenda of both parties is to prove that they're right, you know, and to be heard, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of wondered as I was reading, oh, my shirt's on backwards. Look, there's my tag. That's got to fit in smoothly to some point I'm making.
You're backwards.
I wondered why there was a seam right down the front. I was like, that's a little weird and severe, but you know, brand new shirt. That's just how the style is, I guess. Yeah. So as you can see, my approach to talking about hard things is to bumble in and make an ass of myself in order for the other person to feel comfortable. But actually, when you're having difficult conversations with someone, that can be a liability because I have a tendency to sort of throw myself onto the fire and say like, I'm sure I messed a bunch of things up, and let's just to get someone to talk, like I do everything wrong. I don't even know what's right anymore. I know it seems like I think I know everything, but I absolutely don't. Like, let's just have a conversation. But sometimes I concede too much and apologize too much, and then I sleep on it, and I'm like, hold on, like when am I going to actually assert my own needs in the situation? Which I think is, that's a really difficult thing when you're talking about hard things and talking about needs. You get into this a little bit in the sex chapter, where you talk about how hard it is to talk about your needs and trust someone and navigate. Maybe you can summarize like all the different layers of that, because I feel like I was like, God, this is such a good, a good breakdown of the different elements involved.
Well, I think I know what page. I have a sentence that somebody
nice
me recently, and I was like, oh my God, I did a very good job.
That's good. That's how you want to feel.
Okay, so here's the section where I'm like trying to say, I talked about death. The hard thing is like the reality of loss. Like there's no getting around it. The thing with sex conversations, that there's no getting around the dynamic of what you're doing, is if you're going to share about what you want and need from someone else, there's that question of like, do they want and need that from me? There's that risk of embarrassment, shame, rejection, mismatch. And that's why the stakes are hard. That's why it's hard. But what I say just generally about sex is one of the most potent ways we communicate with one another. It's a wordless conversation, but managing its power takes words. Whether it's a one-time fling or a 60-year marriage, sex requires us to articulate our own needs while attending to someone else's. So there you have this like idea of like, this is what is happening in any relationship or sex conversation. It's like, I'm trying to figure out how to say what I want and need, which obviously, for example, if you're a woman who is trained not to think about what your desires are or that they had any value or needed to be articulated, that takes work. And then you've got to sort of say like, oh, and this person's going to say back to me what they want and need. And we've just got to like do this push and pull to see if it matches up.
And sometimes the conversation itself tells you a lot about how much you can trust the act itself. You know what I mean? Like you have the conversation and it's almost like a model of the act. If it goes well, you're like, I feel like I can trust this person naturally.
Yeah. I share a lot of my personal business in the book. And one thing I share is about my relationship with my husband. And when we were first getting together, like I was crumpled. I was just out of my first marriage. I was kind of all over the place. And what I remember about us talking about kind of like what we were doing, we were this long distance fling that became more, and what was it? I just remember being so struck that he could handle it, that I could just say, here are all the things that I'm feeling. And I didn't have to like do the thing where you're like, how do I explain how I'm feeling in a way that's not going to make him feel threatened or freak out, or that I'm going to have to comfort him. And it was just like, oh, this rules, like, and to what you're saying, like, it didn't suggest to me exactly like what sex would be like with him, but it suggested something, a whole relationship that included sex would be like with him.
Yeah, I love this scene in the book where when you started to go into your relationships, I was like, oh, good. I'm going to learn some things. Good. But I really love this scene where you're walking back from the wedding that was like it was one of your first dates, essentially. And you start having feelings about the fact that your first marriage had fallen apart, and the minister had said all this stuff about, you can't let marriage fail. You can't give up.
Really
you know,
heard that message.
which I mean, amazing. And it was like this cathartic moment for you where you, all these things caught up to you. And Arthur just says, at first he sort of, it makes faintly, somewhat tentative, comforting sounds. And then he says, let me just, and you keep saying, it's fine, I'm fine. And then he says, I'll just go to my truck and you can sit here for a minute. And he knew to give you that. It's very beautiful. It's like, I mean, I thought, but I would want him to stay. I would want to talk about it right there, and he was like, but I sort of understood the way that you write it. He respects your space and he knows it's too soon for you to dive into this heavy conversation necessarily, but it was such a nice snapshot of why you would choose this man, actually.
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. If he had stayed and wanted to talk about it, I think I wouldn't have.
It might have been too much.
Yeah. Like because my habit was to be like, I got it. It's fine. Like I can push, and I think that there's something, we were in this like wild, it was an outdoor wedding. And there was also something I think about being in nature. And he's like, I'm going to take the path back to the truck, but you should just go step into the woods there and sit on a log. So all of a sudden I'm in like the middle of the forest in a wedding dress, like in a wedding outfit and dress shoes. And it was just like, how did he know that I just needed to go into this little nature cove and have a moment?
So you weren't on the path where people were walking by anymore.
Yeah. And like,
that's what I pictured. That's funny.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Jesus, it was very, that to speak about like the ability to like let your partner sorting through what they're going through, like that section, I sort of was like, how do I sum up what that phase of our relationship was? And it was so much around him allowing me to just kind of say in lots of different ways, like, I don't know what I want with you or where this is going, because I just don't know. I know that I something really special. My life is kind of upside down, and it was okay that I could just decide to be with him. He made it okay by what he said. He said, just decide if you want to call me tomorrow. And like, I have not been capable of that in my relationships, like to sit with that uncertainty. But wow, like the possibility when you can say to your partner, I see you're going through something, and I know that it's important that you do that, and I can handle it while you go through it. Like, it's amazing.
Another moment that I'm thinking of, it was amazing, and it reminds me a little bit of when you talk about telling your parents that you got divorced and how they reacted to that. They were so solid, and your dad said he completely understood. And it made me think, my God, you've got a lot of secure people in your life, like, can we all talk about hard things, or is it just Anna? Seems unnatural almost.
Well, I thought about that phone call because it was, the night that I did decide, like, it was like, we're getting divorced, that my first marriage ended, and I called my parents. And, there's a lot of ways, like I wouldn't say I have like a history of like really deep sharing with my parents, like we're not like best friends kind of kids and parents. Mm-hmm. But that was so, it felt to me like they just said the main thing that they said. My dad said, I know he went through a divorce before he married my mom. So he was able to say, I know what this feels like. But the other thing that they said was like, we're here and you're not, you have your family, which for anyone who's gone through a divorce or like a breakup, that all of a sudden it feels like, what is my life? Who are my people? And to just be, to have my parents know to say that, couldn't have asked for it, but they knew how to say that. It was very tremendous. But of course, not all families can do that. And then it's about figuring out what kind of relationship you want to have. And that's what I tried to explore in the family chapter is like, sometimes family can be this incredible place to fall into when you need people who get you and hold you. But also it can be a place of tremendous pain if you don't feel like they're your people and you think, why aren't they my people? They're supposed to be. And in every family relationship, that the kind of hard thing that I wanted to just kind of focus on with family is like every family relationship has some variation on that tension, because you have with these people this shared origin, and with that comes a lot of expectation of understanding or familiarity. And then also in family, like the experience of growing up in a family is individuating, becoming a grown-up, separating. So there's gonna be those gaps where they're not gonna get you. And I wanted to put forth, like, that's family. That doesn't mean you're doing family wrong. But then in your family, how do you want to talk about that? Do you want to sort of minimize those differences so you can kind of just focus on that feeling of togetherness? Is there something in your life that if your family doesn't know about you, that you feel just totally misunderstood? I interviewed a woman who was like, I know my parents aren't going to be able to handle this, but they need to know I'm gay, and they couldn't handle it. And it did take a long time, but they came back around, because then the threat was, do we want you in our life or not? And these things take time in family, but it's that, where am I going to break from the pattern of how we relate to each other, and where am I going to try to protect it?
Yeah, I like how you, when you talk about family, you definitely make it very clear that everyone, and this is something that I've seen myself through my advice column, Ask Polly, everyone has something, some bit of trouble with their family. It's just impossible not to. If you did the healthy thing and became a person, like you said, you rejected something about the way that you were raised, and you freely chose a new way of being. But that doesn't mean necessarily that your whole life has to take the shape of that, continuing to reject those people. It's just that you have to understand that your part of your personality and your identity has been formed from that, not them, and accepting that is actually intimacy in some ways. I mean, intimacy is being locked in with someone and being committed to them, and knowing you're not going to ever abandon them, or at least within, unless their behavior is completely off the map. You're committed to staying with them, but being that locked in feeling, and knowing, oh God, this again, this is the thing I hate. When I vacation with my family, sometimes I go down to, thank God for my husband. Sometimes I go down to the bedroom that we share. Like we all stay in one house at the beach that we rent every year. And I'll go down to the, it'll be like 4 days in, things are pretty good. Things are good. That's like, I'm being good. And sometimes I'll say to Bill, I'll say, I've been really good. I'm doing really well. I haven't messed up. And then one day I'll go down and I'll be like, you just have to keep eating their shit. You just got to keep eating. Just have to eat they're just going to serve you shit and you got to eat it. And you just have this breakdown where, and when you're in that state emotionally, what you think is, I have the craziest, worst, most terrible, most hideous family. And it's not that some of us really do have insane, crazy. I hate to use the word crazy, intensely unhinged, nutty families that make us feel like we're losing our minds, like we just can't even see straight. But I feel like there's a point in your life where you you start to accept that this experience is actually universal. It's not just a sitcom plot, it's out there for a reason. We all go through it. And the answer isn't always to, move 3,000 miles away and never look back. I mean,
Yeah.
because when you push through and say, it's okay, of course they make me feel like I'm falling apart. Of course. This is just what happens. My mom and I now talk about how, like, remember, we're going to drive each other crazy. Yeah, we're going to drive each other crazy. We acknowledge that before family trips now. And it makes it a lot better because it's that acceptance. I mean, you talk about this a lot in that chapter, which I really liked. The acceptance of that
Yeah,
intimacy.
because I think that's like, I mean, there's this quote. I was like, who has thought about families? And I was looking at just mid 20th centuries for psychologists and people who'd written about family therapy and family systems. And Murray Bowen, who created sort of this idea of family systems, he has this quote that he was just like, that the goal is to be an individual in relationship, like with family. Like, and that's so simply said. And also why beach vacations are really hard. Because you're like, oh my goodness, you're driving me insane. Like, I am a grown up with my own, and you're treating me like I'm a 12-year-old or, and then I revert back to being a teenage rebel. Don't tell me what to do. Like, we have all these patterns of our relationships. And if there's a way where you can be like, oh, this thing is happening again, like, it doesn't make it go away. You and your mom still probably agitate each other, even when you name it ahead of time. But at least you're like, oh, there's the thing. It's happening. Instead of saying like, oh my God, my mom is the worst. I need to,
Yeah. But so part of it is understanding when to talk and when not to talk, which you talk about a lot in your book, which I think is like, to me, it's sort of, okay. So this is skipping a little bit through the book, but at the end of the book, you talk about seeing your ex-husband again and realizing that there's nothing else. There's no more closure that's needed. That's a little bit of a spoiler. Sorry, but
that's okay. I mean, it's okay because that's sort of what it felt like. It was like I've set up. I mean, this is how in my reporting I was like, "Hello, I'm working on a book, and our divorce is part of the narrative arc, and I really want to make sure I understand what it was like for you." And initially, I was like, "Oh, I know what I'll do. I'm going to make him a character in the book." And make him really sympathetic and then do the thing at the very end of it. And that terrible ex was me. I wanted to like try out really inhabiting his point of view at the end of our marriage. And so we did. We sat down and I said, I just want to talk about what you remember about the end of our marriage and the conversations we had. And what was so it was unfulfilling in the moment and then in the long term very like affirming was that even when I like got in my death, sex and money interview mode and asked him really specific questions to try to tease out like what did I miss back then, you remember that moment? I remember feeling really strongly about that, but what was that like for you? And it was, I want to say, like, oh my gosh, like, how gracious of him to go out to do that with me. But we didn't uncover anything new. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. Hard conversation. At the end of our marriage, we did the couples counseling, we read the books, we did all the things. It took a lot of time figuring it out, trying to figure out if we could figure it out. All of like not getting to a resolution where we were like, oh, this is going to fix the marriage. That those conversations felt so sad and unsatisfactory because they were showing us that the marriage didn't have a future. And so I think that there's a really important when you're talking about and like thinking, do I need to just talk about this more? If I just like dig in more, am I gonna like, no, sometimes when you talk and exchange, here's my experience of this, here's your experience of this, you want this thing, I want this thing, like, oh, we have enough information. Like,
Yeah.
we can let this conversation be the last time we go back over this and we litigate it and we can release it and we can say, like, we had a good run. I had a friend who said that to us. He was a friend of both me and my ex, and he said, well, we had a good run. And I just thought it was the most loving, because I was feeling so much shame and failure, etc. And it was just like, you were together during some important years in each other's lives, and you can let each other go forth separately.
Yeah. It's funny because I think as a journalist and as a writer, our tendency is often to not want to let these things just drop, or we think there's more information to get, right?
Yeah.
Which can be kind of an impediment to having conversations with regular people who do not think that way, who are just like, my objective in life is not to keep digging and digging and digging for more layers. My objective is to actually be a productive human in the world. I mean, there are a lot of different types of people who don't like to do that. I wonder if you find yourself, do people get paranoid around you because you're searching for more information? I mean, do you find that there's just from my perspective as an advice giver, people can get very paranoid that I'm writing about them often, or that I have a lot of opinions about their situations when I'm not thinking about them at all, or that I'm very judgmental because I do a lot of judging in my column, where in my life I've sort of grown into a much more and more less judgmental space because I think about these things all the time, and I've noticed my own fallibility constantly. But I do think that I have learned to hold back in my interrogation of people a little more, because it's, most people aren't ready for that. Have you had a similar experience in your life where you've had to, like, I can't do this? Or is your personal life very different from, I mean, you have 2 little kids. They're easy to interrogate.
Yeah. I mean, sort of. I try to talk. I'm like talking to the almost 5-year-old, like, how do you feel about preschool ending? And she's like, where's popsicles?
Yeah.
I would say, in my life, it doesn't manifest so much as like, I'm at a dinner party and I hear somebody, has recently had something difficult happen in their lives, and I'm like, so how you doing? And I don't like do that, but I do, for me, my work is so like, I heard that little thing that you mentioned, and I'm going to say, like, what was that like? I didn't know that's where you met your wife. What was going on in your life? Like, I just want to know. And that can be, mostly, I hope that feels, back. You hear that? Mostly that I think feels hopefully like good for the person I'm talking to, because someone's interested in hearing them talk. Like that's often the thing. But I will say the other thing that your question made me think about is my husband, Arthur, will often say, like, because when I get anxious, I like latch on to like money anxiety. Like, that's what I do. And so I'll have this idea of like, oh, like, I just need to make sure that Arthur knows the situation with our taxes. And I'll like bring this up, and he'll be like, didn't we talk about this a few weeks ago? And like kind of decide what our big picture budget was, and it was fine. Like, didn't we talk about this? And he'll sort of be like, I see what you're doing by trying to talk about this hard thing is really you're just like trying to get a scab because you're anxious. And he's like, we talked about this. And I find that pushback really useful, because it's like, if you're anxious, just say I'm feeling anxious. Don't like make me do emotional work around our taxes when we've already done it.
Yeah, you can't put a shape on. I think after a long time in your marriage, you realize that you can't, just like throw you pipe your anxiety into different shapes and say, like, now we're going to do, we're We're going to talk about money, but it's really about, trust and our different values and our principles. And now we're going to talk. I mean, one of the things that you point out repeatedly and that I end up pointing out in my column a lot is when you're talking about sex, you're not just talking about sex. You're talking about everything in your relationship at once, including money in some crazy ways, and so it's like you learn to talk about the feeling. I mean, that's a kind of classic of couples therapy, obviously, that you always start with, I'm feeling, sad and lonely. But what's interesting is there are, having been to couples therapy with, my God, I think 2 men who I didn't marry. Is that it? Maybe 2. Yeah. It's interesting how you don't necessarily, I mean, your conversation with your ex reminded me of this. There's a kind of dead end. I think what I'm trying to say is there's an interesting place you land with both friendships, less so with family because you either make the commitment there or not in some ways, but with friendships and with partnerships, with love relationships, you can reach this place where you start to think there's something broken about the way we interact. There's something here that and it's a mutual collaboration. It's not that one person is bad or one person triggers the other person necessarily. It's that we build some kind of a strange prison that doesn't recognize either of our humanity, And so you can either say, are you willing to redesign this prison and make it a playground with me? Or are you not willing? And I guess I have one question. Okay, sorry, this is a long question. It is a question. No, I'm getting like somewhere.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering, what are some signs to you that things are done where it's too hard and you can't have the conversations you need to have? And also, what is, it's so hard to decide, I'm not going to convince this person to give me what I want. I'm just going to let it go and back away. When you're invested and you love someone, I guess I wonder, I don't know. I lost track of my own stupid question.
No, I will say, you bring up a lot of good, because that's the thing. Like, how do I know? How do I know if I need to do more work?
Yeah.
Or how do I know telling me that we're doomed and I'm in denial that we're doomed? Like, that's the question when you are feeling that I'm going to speak about romantic relationships, but it also comes up in friendships, in which case it's even harder to name because talking within friendships can be, where do you even start? Something that I'm going to tell you 2 things that I think really stuck with me around that question, because that is the question I was circling around personally when I was like, I don't know, with Arthur, I don't know, I don't want to get divorced again. Like, what did I rush into that early marriage? Like, how do I not have this fall apart again? So I was really scared. And one thing that I think, for when you can sort of allow in the possibility of maybe this relationship has run its course, I was really helped, and this is so nerdy of me, but by I heard this business professor at Stanford give a talk once about negotiation, and she was her whole talk was there's this famous text in business schools, it's called Getting to Yes, about negotiations, and she was just no, that's not the point of negotiating. The whole point is not to get to yes. The whole point is to see if you can make a deal that works for both of you. And if you can't get to yes and you walk away from the table, the negotiation was also it did its job, And so that was a useful thing for me to keep reminding myself of at the end of my marriage, of just oh, I'm not failing to just get us over this hurdle. Sometimes, again, when you talk about hard things, you're what has been revealed to us is you want to make movies and travel the world, and I want to have kids in a house. Like, and you feel threatened and hemmed in by me. And I feel really sad about that. And that was the thing we were fighting about, and took a really long time to just figure that out. Um, and but then the other thing I wanted to share was like before I started Death, Sex, and Money, after I started dating Arthur, my now husband, I traveled the country as a political reporter, and I would stop and talk to voters, like do that thing. And I interviewed this guy in Iowa who was a farmer in this county where there had been a lot of failed small farms. Like all the small guys had been sort of like long run out of business, and now it was a bunch of corporate firms. And he was telling me about, seeing how this had changed his community, and all the marriages that had gone bust that he'd watched, including his siblings, and how hard it was to get through. And he'd had his own troubles, like with his family business, and his wife had been a school teacher, and he'd done something like they just sort of like struggled, but they'd gotten through it together. And I remember, I had this like desperate, like, well, what was different for you, And he just said, he was like, well, I think we had the same plan, and just like something so simple about marriage specifically, like, when you have the same idea about there's this house that we built that somehow doesn't have a bathroom, and we need a bathroom, but we have these things in this house that we really want to take care of. We need to figure out how to build a bathroom together, or it could be like, actually, these things that we built and have in this house that we care about, maybe we can build 2 different houses and make it work. But that's the question, is like, and that's not something that I can't tell you when you can see that in a hard conversation. Like, it's something you try and you try and you try, and then you feel it.
Yeah.
And then when you accept it, that maybe you've tried as much as you can, there can be a great release in accepting that what you thought was going to be the future is not, in fact, going to be the future.
Yeah. And also to realize that what someone wants is a different thing than what you want. What their vision of, even in a friendship, it can be the other person's vision of the friendship is different than yours. The way that, because sometimes when you enter a relationship, you think it's like you have a vision of how it's going to go. You're like, oh, we're this kind of friend. We're going to be like this. Yeah. And the other person is like, no, that's not how I do friendship. It doesn't look like that. Yeah. So it's partially just unearthing that. And then it kind of frees you up after you realize, oh, these 2 visions are not compatible, and that's okay. We can love each other and still not be able to make the same thing. We can't make our visions match up. I guess maybe I'll ask you one more question. It looks like we don't have any questions. If anyone who's tuning in has any questions, you can just type them in to the Say Something Nice area down there. But if no one writes a question, this will be the last question, I think. And that is, unless we have extra time, which who knows, but it looks like we have about 6 minutes. Do you think it's getting harder lately for people to have hard conversations? And if so, what are the factors that make that the case? I mean, if you don't have an opinion about that, I can ask you a different question. It looks like someone has a question here too, but if you'd rather answer a question from the audience instead of my extremely difficult question about the times, you can do that too.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to weave in an answer to this question, and then I'm going to answer.
Oh, nice, masterful.
Question about being asked to MC a funeral for someone. Can everybody see? Everybody can see this question. So, how do I do this? Because I'm afraid of losing my composure because I miss her, and how much humor is too much to keep everybody kind of level. For me, I mean, I would just sort of think about the person who is no longer with you, and like, think the eulogies that it's the most of the ones that capture the spirit of the person who's gone. So it kind of depends on how um uh how she carried herself, like what way you think, kind of channeling her spirit. And then I think the question of how I get through it, it's like it's kind of practicing, it's practicing and like playing it in front of the mirror and crying when you need to cry. And then when you're doing it in front of people and you feel those emotions there, it's also okay if you lose your composure in front of people, because I often find that can be a prompt for other people to sort of have that exhale of emotion that they might be trying to hold on at a memorial service. And I think this is a question. I'm now in Cody, Wyoming. I am going to do an event locally here because a lot of characters in this book are from Wyoming, and I feel very grateful for that, and I want to celebrate that. But your question, Heather, about is it harder? I think so, and I think so for so many reasons. Like, first of all, like we're have this experience of a pandemic where we've been physically separated, and so our conversations and words between Zoom and text messages and phone calls, like, because we haven't been able to gather and have that be the sort of like, another note in the symphony of how we communicate, like there's been more pressure on our words, you know. I also think that like our political moment has made it. It's really hard. I think each of us in America, every institution, every family, every community, is figuring out what are our norms now of how we communicate about what are the shared principles and what are the things that we can say, okay, we see that there's some agreement on this, but there's enough stitching us together that we're going to find a way to feel belonging or feel in coalition together, if you might think about it politically, and how those lines are drawn and how we're each deciding how we come down on that is really tough. I mean, our democracy is in turmoil, and a lot has been sort of not just because of particular politicians, but also the systems of how we communicate and the media we take in. Like all of this, there's not a lot of things that are working in the interest of having us have healthy relationships where there's the possibility to talk about where we disagree. So doing that, which is what I'm arguing that we figure out how to do, how to like really listen with curiosity while also figuring out how to honor your own values, like that's pushing the boulder up the hill against a lot of really big forces. But I also think because of the turmoil in institutions and the turmoil in communities, like that's all the more reason why we have to each take on that work and kind of commit to leaning in, trying to be a little bit more skillful, because we have to figure this out together. So that's how I would answer your question.
Yeah. It feels like the culture is shifting, and a lot of people are ready to engage in a way. We've all had a little time to ourselves at home, and it's interesting. I think we're in actually a kind of interesting, promising place. But yeah, I agree with you. It's a strange thing, and it is an incredibly important time to start to take on conversations. It's interesting that you talk about conflict is not abuse at the end of your book, because I'm reading it now also, and it's so good.
Everyone should read it. I
have it right here.
And like,
I like the cover too. Oh, but I should hold up your book. Oh, but I have the cover off your book. Your book is behind you. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I have a quote from Sarah Schulman in the very beginning. It's one is the values required for social repair are the same values required for personal repair. So if you think of that as like what we do in our relationships are also what affects how our society works.
Yeah. And if you're avoiding all of your personal hard conversations and that becomes your default, the community suffers at some level too,
Yeah.
because there's not that connection. I think just the guiding force of this book is we care about connection. We don't even understand how much we care about it, most of us. And in each of the stories of the book, it winds up being this. I mean, a lot of people say things like, this was one of the most important things that happened in my life, is that I found a way to connect with this person. So I think you're bringing a good message to the world at a rough time. And I really appreciate being able to talk to you about it.
Thanks. Well, before
It's
we
a
go,
great
I
book.
also say, Heather, if you're an Ask Polly fans out there, I hope you have migrated to Substack to keep following your Heather's writing. So I have found your writing, both in your book, when it's What If This Is Enough, when it came out, I held it in my hands and I said, like, I finished this book and it's like taking on these really big things and it's proof that I can somehow finish this book that I didn't think I was ever going to
If she can do it.
No, in this way, I was like, oh, I really love these big questions that you grapple with. And then, so I hope everyone who listened to this and got some of this conversation also moves to find where you're writing now, because I just find it so, it's like a coach who like really is compassionate and also like tells you to step up when you need to step up. And I find that really
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I needed a coach to get ready to interview the best interviewer around. But I think we did okay.
Good.
Yeah, and it was good. Max, are you going to come back into yes, there you are.
Yes, I
It's
am.
really nice.
So we'll go ahead and wrap up there. Anna and Heather, thank you both so much. That was a wonderful talk. I enjoyed listening to it. I'm sure everyone else did. Everyone in the audience, thanks for joining and listening with us tonight. Again, if you'd like to purchase Anna's book, it's down there, like green button. We also have a copy of Heather's book on our website, so if you look her up, you can go and find that too. But with that all out of the way, thank you all so much and have a good night.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.